Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're continuing our series where we deep dive into all of the Myers-Briggs personality types, all 16 of them. And today we're talking about the ESFJ personality type in the Myers-Briggs system, which is the harmony memory personality in the personality hacker system.
Now, what's interesting about ESFJs is that they are one of the most represented types amongst women. So if you do a demographic breakdown of each personality type and you include gender, ESFJs make up about 12 or 13% of the female population. And so quite a few women are of this type. However, that's not to say that there aren't also quite a few men of this type. I think if you do a demographic breakdown, it's something around 6 to 8% of men are ESFJs. So a lot of stereotypes around people of this type have a feminine or a stereotypically woman bent, but that's not necessarily the case. So what we'll attempt to do in this podcast is, as we do a deep dive into ESFJs, we're going to try to look at it from both a female and a male perspective and fillet out what are some stereotypes around women that might get projected on to ESFJ women, and then also how this looks when it's not a woman who's an ESFJ, what it looks like when it's a man as well.
I think to piggyback off of that, what you said about a high majority of women, or not majority, a high percentage of women that are ESFJs, what ends up happening then is, because they're represented so much in the population, I think the general stereotypes about women also come from the ESFJ personality. So we have kind of this idea that ESFJ has a feminine quality to it, but we also project ESFJ characteristics onto all women in our culture often. So we see, you'll see people talk about these tendencies or these stereotypes about women, and I think a lot of times those come from the ESFJ personality.
Exactly. So what we're going to do first is, as usual, we're going to do a breakdown of the CAR model for this type, and then we're going to basically, do a bit of a deep dive into some of the ways that the personality type manifests, shows up, our relationship with them, and some of our observations of the type.
Yeah. So
the personality type of ESFJ leads with, if you look at the CAR model. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the CAR model, if this is the first podcast of ours you've heard, the CAR model is our way of creating a metaphor to understand what are called your cognitive function stack. And we recommend that you go to the website, plug in CAR model into the search field at personalityhacker.com, and then get an overview of what that looks like. And for ESFJs, their leading cognitive function, or what we call the driver in their car, is a cognitive function technically called extroverted feeling, but we've nicknamed this harmony. Now, the way that extroverted feeling or harmony shows up is that it's an instinctive understanding of the emotional relationship between people. So it's a sophisticated understanding of our dynamics. And that makes sense because it's extroverted feeling, right? It's feeling that is projected out to the world. And if you're leading with a function that is paying attention to how people are emoting, right, or extroverting their feelings, well, what does that mean? Well, that means that every time we emote, we're going to naturally, if there's another human being around, we're going to impact them, and then they're going to give a response. And it's this interplay or dance of emotions between people that really captures an ESFJ. That's the thing that they're focused on. That's what they use to evaluate the criteria of their decision making. This is how they have determined, this is what they've determined as the most important thing, how we are impacting each other on an emotional level. Now, at an embryonic level, this is simply, I make an action that impacts somebody else emotionally, they emote, and then I receive their emotion, and then I respond in kind, or I respond in a different way. That's the very base level. But as this process gets more and more sophisticated, as the ESFJ ages and builds skill in it, eventually it gets to a point where they recognize and understand how entire societies of people are creating emotional dances to keep each other in a high morale place, right? Ideally. Because if we're always impacting each other on an emotional level, and we can't get a handle on that, then we might see nothing but conflict, right? And conflict is not really ideal, because if you're super in touch with other people's emotional experience, the more conflict you're experiencing, the more taxing that is on you as a person, right? That eventually becomes exhausting. So that's why we call this process harmony, because eventually it becomes very clear that in order to keep everybody okay and not have us being exhausted all the time with our emotional interplays, what we want to do is we want to get through conflict and reach the end game of harmony. So what happens is we as societies create unspoken social contracts or ways that it's appropriate for us to behave toward each other in order to keep that harmonious place.
So you could see that for an ESFJ, with this idea of harmony on the mind, wanting to make sure everyone is getting along, making sure that society on a macro level is stabilized and is, interacting well. And then on a micro level, people in your family or your friend circles, if you're an ESFJ, all of those interactions are going well. You can see why an ESFJ would be very interested in people arts, things that involve people, whether it's being a teacher, someone that teaches others how we're going to be in the world, or someone who is a hostess or a host, someone who loves hosting people, loves being the person that's constructing social engagements, taking the lead on, the girls' weekend out or the guys' golfing outing, whether you're a girl or a guy, depending. Like, this is something interesting to you, creating social situations where people can interact with each other and get along, and you helping make those things happen as an ESFJ. And I think the question that harmony always asks in any social situation is, what gets everyone's needs met? What is going to be the thing that meets the needs of the people that are in this interaction, whether it's a dinner party, a political event, a family gathering at the holidays, a classroom, whatever that is. Harmony's asking the question, okay, what's going to get the needs met of the people involved right now that I have an impact around?
Right. And I think this is a place where you can really see how the same root desire manifests itself in two very different ways depending upon gender. What we believe is acceptable and socially appropriate if you're a woman is very different than what's socially appropriate and acceptable as a man. And so men who use harmony as a driver process, those who are leading with this process of extroverted feeling, aren't necessarily going to show up in any, particularly feminized way, right? Like, they're going to show up in a way where society has deemed it appropriate, or the way that they believe that society deems it appropriate for them to behave. So men who lead with the harmony process might actually be extremely masculine. They may show up in a very masculine way, but they're still thinking in terms of getting those needs met. So they can be one of those like really masculine men that are a big teddy bear inside. They can have, a lot of these stereotypes about how a man is actually quite giving or sweet or caring, but they're not losing any of that masculine tone. That is oftentimes somebody who's leading with the harmony process. For women, they get lots of messages around how socially appropriate it is for them to be feminine. And so women who lead with the harmony process can be quite feminine. So even though they are leading with the same process, because the evaluation or the criteria is based on gender a lot, right? Like based on how you're supposed to show up, whether or not you're a man or a woman, the same root cause actually ends up having them behave in totally polarized ways. And that's one way that you can really understand how just because we have these stereotypes around ESFJs being women, men who are ESFJs might show up in a rather masculine way and not lose any of that harmony component.
I think for men, if you're a harmony man, if you're an ESFJ man, you probably have your hand or mind on the pulse of, like Antonia talked about, the culture around you and what the expectations are. And so I think for a lot of ESFJ men, they take their cues from what society says is the appropriate behavior. So I've noticed that ESFJ men have a tendency, not always, but have a tendency to be very interested in things that will give external markers to other people that they are doing the socially appropriate man thing, right? So a lot of times, even if it's authentic for you as an ESFJ to do something that feels more in alignment with you, you might still find yourself doing, I'll call them, and I hate to paint it this way, but I want to make sure I'm very clear when I say this. You might find yourself doing caricaturized things that give other people an indication of manhood rather than just what's always authentic to you. So for example, we know of an ESFJ guy that we met who was really into cars. He was really into vehicles and like the look and style of cars. And I think I could sense that when he was talking about cars, it wasn't something he was interested in them, but it sounded like it was something he was supposed to be interested in. And I think a lot of ESFJ men find themselves in positions where they're doing something because they're supposed to be doing it, not because it's truly something that they desire or want. So I think that's something just to watch out for if you are an ESFJ guy, that this is something that can come up for you sometimes.
I think women do the same thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, when they're leading with the harmony process, they can play along or play nice in something that they're not particularly interested in, but that's what the group of friends are interested in. That's what the circle is interested in. So they play, they play as if they're interested in it as well.
Thanks for mentioning that. I wasn't trying to disclude women. I was trying to just speak directly to men specifically in that.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, and I think it's actually something that shows up for all people who lead with the harmony process. And I don't know if this is as offensive to the person who's using harmony, like the ESFJ. I don't know if this is as offensive to them as it would be to somebody who maybe is leading with authenticity. To fake or pretend that you're into something when you're using the authenticity process can feel like you're destroying your soul. Whereas I think when harmony people do this, they legitimately are still honoring their decision-making process of wanting to make the group feel comfortable. It's not really about them, it's about other people. And so for other types, it can feel like they're being fake, but I actually don't think it is. And this is something important to remember about people of this type, is that if they are doing something that you suspect might be not 100% in their wheelhouse or in their, interests, the zone of interest, it might not be that they're trying to shine it on in a bad way. This is not manipulative necessarily. This is because they're keeping the morale up. This is because they want to meet your need. This is the thing you're interested in, so they want to be interested in it with you. And so I think that's important to remember for other types as they're observing a harmony person meeting you where you're at. This doesn't have the same meaning for them as it would for you. For me, as an accuracy person, this would actually be a really bad sign. This would mean that I'm being dishonest with myself and I'm in cognitive dissonance and that I'm just shining it on for other people. And this would actually be a really bad sign for somebody like me. But for a harmony person, I think it's still in their zone of genius to be able to meet people where they're at. So, it can show up bad. It can show up as blatant lying for sure. But it's not always that. And so if you hold space for somebody who's using the harmony process, when they're trying to get other people's needs met, and that might mean that they're underplaying their personal interests or underplaying their needs, that's actually quite natural to them. And that's one of the things that they do quite well is allow other people's needs to be important and represented. And of course, they want to do that with their needs as well, but it's much easier for them to look at others and focus on the other person's need.
I couldn't agree more. And also, if you're an ESFJ listening, just realize, I think this is a great point here, just realize that other people that are other different personality types might not want to play along for the sake of the group because they do have that internal metric that's coming up for them. And I've seen ESFJs get frustrated by people who are they're like, what, can't you just play along and get along so we can have this social engagement, this social experience? And someone might say, no, that doesn't feel authentic or that doesn't make sense to me. And I think that frustrates potentially the ESFJ who just wants everybody to have a great time. They want everybody to have a great experience. And it's like, can't you just put aside your personal stuff for 2 hours during this dinner party, please? And it's frustrating. So as an ESFJ, just understand this is the dynamic that's happening. For you, it makes sense to put aside some of your own needs for the group, but that doesn't always make sense for everybody. And some people struggle with that more than others, depending on their personality.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like this might be one of the biggest sources of confusion between ESFJs and other types is exactly what you just mentioned. However, one thing that we always have to make sure that we talk about when we talk about the harmony process is the tendency for harmony to focus too much on other people's needs and not enough on its own. When harmony asks the question, what gets everybody's needs met, it's incredibly important to remember that you are part of everybody. When we sent out the survey for ESFJs, one of the interesting responses that we got back was a couple people mentioned, of course, that they're always focused on everybody else and it's really hard for them to get their need met. One person mentioned that when I articulate a need, they really wanted other people to understand that this was difficult for them. Like, if they articulated a need, it was because they could no longer ignore it and they had been ignoring it for a while. So if an ESFJ articulates a need, that means that they like went through a period of time of trying to get it met themselves or trying to simply ignore it, and they finally broke down and said what their need was. So this is big stuff. So if you hear somebody of this type articulate a need, take it very seriously. The other thing is, one of the people on the survey said that they might play along as if they don't have any needs, or somebody will go, "Hey, are you okay?" And they'll go, yeah, I'm fine. But they're not, and they need you to push a little bit. Now, I understand that when you are used to focusing on other people, it's really probably quite obnoxious or frustrating or maybe simply sad and confusing that other people don't do the same back. And this is really one of the most important components of understanding typology, is realizing that not everybody behaves the same way that we do. So it's really important for ESFJs to recognize that, yeah, it would be nice if other people played the same game that you do of pushing and making sure that your need is met, just like you make sure other people's needs are, but that's not always going to be the case. So it's really important to make sure that you are communicating your needs clearly to other people and that you're in relationships where people are honoring when you communicate this. If you find yourself in relationships where people just are not caring when you tell them what your needs are, then you're probably not in a very good relationship. The dynamic needs to change to be able to accommodate you being just as honest about what your needs are as you are accommodating other people when they're telling you their needs. So this is a really important thing to remember. It's not other people's job to push you. It's your job to communicate and then make sure you're in the kinds of relationships where people are honoring that.
Yeah, you have a superpower of seeing what people need, right? So let's just say a hypothetical example, you and your spouse, you typically anticipate your spouse's needs. You anticipate what they need in life, and you meet those needs a lot of times. And then all of a sudden, maybe you get into an argument with your spouse and something happens where you feel like you're not getting your needs met and you blow up, you explode on them, which is very uncharacteristic for you. You might walk upstairs and slam the door in the room, and when they come up to knock and say, what's wrong? And you say, "Oh, nothing, just leave me alone, nothing's wrong, it's fine, just leave me alone, nothing's wrong." You don't really mean that. There's something obviously bothering you. You have a need, and you expect other people to have the same superpower you have, to identify what's going on for you and to try to come and pursue you and help you figure this thing out. Well, again, what Antonia talked about, articulating those needs for other people, is going to be important because other people don't have the superpower you have. They just don't get it the way you do. You have this amazing ability that other people just obviously can't seem to get the way you get. So the more forthcoming you are with some of the needs that you have also, and you see, if you're a mature ESFJ, you've probably figured this out over time, that if I want my spouse or my friends or my lover or my children or my parents to give me the kind of needed attention that I desire, I've got to articulate this. I can't assume they can read my mind or just guess what my needs are, anticipate them like I can for other people. So I think that's something that is helpful to think about in terms of, stop for a minute. I know you're upset. You might be really frustrated, but if you can find a way to say, look, give me a couple minutes and I'll tell you what's going on for me, that will help so much for you actually getting some of those needs met that you desire so strongly to get met for yourself.
Yeah, slowing down is actually really important for a couple different reasons. One of the things that it does is it does allow you to be able to check in with yourself and figure out what's going on for you to ensure that your needs are getting met. But it also helps when you slow down and go internal. It helps balance out that driver process because that driver process of extroverted feeling, that's actually technically called a judging process or decision making. And because it's decision making pointed to the outside world, things feel really obvious to you about how they should be, right? Like if you see something that's not appropriate, if you see something that is not keeping that social equilibrium of getting everybody's need met and making sure that there's no conflict or harm happening to other people, and somebody offends one of those rules, it's really easy to get very upset or frustrated at them. But one of the things that helps keep you from being judgmental of other people is by getting into your co-pilot process of what we call memory, but it's technically called introverted sensing. Now, this process it's how you understand the world. It's technically called a perceiving process, and we would like to think of it as, how do you understand information? How do you learn the best? What is the way that you really sort of come to grips with how things are actually working? Not judging them or deciding how they should be, but really just sitting with what is. And the way that introverted sensing works, or memory works, is by picking up information based on your experiences and then capturing them in the form of a memory. Now, that could look like, it could look like a film reel, or it could look like a GIF playing over and over in your head. But it's really about reviewing the things that you've experienced and understanding what they mean to you as a person, how they've impacted you. Where have you seen this before? It very much is about safety, security, making sure that traditions are being upheld. We do a deep dive, or more of a deep dive, into introverted sensing or memory in a previous podcast called Sensing Personality Types. So if you really want to understand a little bit more, I recommend listening to that podcast. But it's more about making sure that things are reliable. Now, the reason why this is such a great foil for the harmony driver is that this allows you to understand that every person has their own unique set of experiences. Just like you've been crafted and fashioned after all these things that you've experienced through your life, and that's made you unique. It's made you a bit quirky based on what you've experienced as an individual. The more you get into that process, the more you realize that everybody is like that. Everybody's quirky based on maybe the family that they were raised in, or maybe the traditions that they upheld, maybe their culture. There are so many different components that help craft who we are based on our experiences that we can't all possibly come to the table with exactly the same needs or exactly the same point of view. So the more you get into that co-pilot process, the more it rounds out that piece of you that might want to jump to conclusions or jump to judgment, maybe even social judgment. This idea that everybody should be behaving according to, these social rules. Well, maybe that person doesn't understand the social rules because they weren't raised with the same social rules that you were. So the more you get into that co-pilot process, the more you give other people grace, and the more you kind of chill out and go, well, I don't really know what's going on with that person. So maybe I'll give them some space for, however they were raised. And I've noticed that really mature ESFJs are more there to be morale boosters, to be there to help make sure that everybody feels good, gets their needs met. And they remove that judgmental component. They remove the component of assuming everybody has to be maybe at a certain status, or if they're not dressed in the right way, that says something bad about them. They're a little more egalitarian, really. They're a little bit more open to unique individual perspectives. And that's one of the most important things you can do. The third thing that it does is it gives you some alone time, or it gives you a place to go when you need some alone time. And as an ESFJ, it might feel like you don't need any alone time, or it might hit you like a ton of bricks when you finally do. My recommendation is to give yourself that alone time that you need. Because if you don't give it to yourself, you will find yourself really running on fumes.
Yeah, one of the recommendations we give ESFJs often is, take the time to go and do the thing that rejuvenates you, something that is tied to either your past or your understanding of something that used to be something you really enjoyed. So oftentimes, whether that's going out into the shed in the back of the house and maybe putting that project together, piddle at that project you really like doing that reminds you of maybe a hobby you had in the past, or maybe it's scrapbooking and spending alone time reflecting on memories, putting together a scrapbook, or maybe it's an online video for your family or friends of that like recent fishing trip you did, or whatever. Or maybe it's drawing a bath and reading a book that really meant something to you when you were younger, and just spending time alone, nurturing yourself, getting your own needs met on a physical level, and also really engaging with something that's tied to your past, tied to something that resonates, that really gives you that stability of who you are and who you've been up till now, because it like reinforces your identity and makes you feel good about being you, because you're caught up so much during the day helping everybody get their needs met. This groundedness to who you really are at the core of your being, tied to your past and the experiences you had, is so powerful for you to review that and spend time there and run over that and just be a part of that experience for yourself.
Yeah, one way to do that is to journal or keep a diary. I've known ESFJs that have kept extensive journals and diaries, and that's actually been very helpful for them because they can go back and review it and then recognize where they came from and help remember the things that are important to them as individuals based on the experiences that they've had. Now, one thing you want to look out for is the desire and tendency to go to what we call your 10-year-old process in the CAR model, but what is technically called your tertiary process of extroverted intuition, or what we've nicknamed exploration. Now, when done well, when an ESFJ is healthy and they go to this process, this is the part of them that is creative. This is the part of them that is fun and adventurous. Oftentimes, this is the part of them that had them have a bit of a wild side when they were teenagers and young. This is the part of you that's fun and gregarious and makes you up for whatever. Like, yeah, let's go do the wild, crazy thing. Now, if you're always going there, though, if you're missing that co-pilot process, and by the way, if this is the first podcast you've heard, our theory at Personality Hacker is that most of us need to develop our co-pilot process more. And we all have a tendency to go to our 10-year-old process when we're in a defensive position or when we're not at our best selves. And the reason why is because that 10-year-old position is in the same extroverted or introverted world as our driver. So if your driver process is extroverted feeling, for you as an ESFJ, your 10-year-old process is extroverted intuition. So it allows you to stay in the outside world. And that's the world that's fun and interesting and engaging and helps you keep you in action, and you don't get bored and you don't just sit around, like you're up doing stuff and you're having fun. However, if you get in the habit of going to this process to help defend or support the decisions you're making in the harmony process or extroverted feeling, then the process of exploration almost always is speculating and asking what if. When you're really good at this process, you're asking questions and speculating, you're asking the what if questions and speculating on really high abstract stuff, right? Like stuff like, what if we could go to the moon? Or, it usually takes a really big game. But at a 10-year-old level, it's usually not speculating on really big stuff. It's usually speculating on whatever it's called to speculate on. And if it's supporting a process that is all about what people are doing and how they're behaving, oftentimes, this is where an ESFJ can run into the stereotype of assuming a person is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, that they're up to no good. When you combine that extroverted feeling and the extroverted intuition, when you combine this and turn it into a loop, as opposed to going to memory, introverted sensing, which is all about like understanding that everybody has their own unique perspective, that they all have experienced different things, that we all have a right to privacy and our own inner world, and that we might not know what's going on, that we need to do more research to verify and ensure that we have the right take on something. When we completely miss that process and go straight to our speculative process, that's where we get phrases like, who knows what they're up to, right? Like, who knows what's going on in that house? And then you have this like delicious speculation about how somebody's up to no good and not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So this is a trap that ESFJs can get into. It's also a place that they go to when they're avoiding a responsibility or avoiding maybe conflict in a relationship or a friendship, or maybe conflict in the home. This is where they distract themselves with things that can be a little wild and crazy, doing things spontaneously, always being in action, always doing the next fun, spontaneous thing, as opposed to asking themselves, okay, what is my responsibility? What is the relationship that I should be managing right now that I'm avoiding? What's the conflict resolution I should be engaged in, but right now I'm off making a new purchase or something. This is where a lot of ESFJs can get into almost addicted to shopping, because shopping allows you to buy something new, right? It gives you the ability to take home something you've never had before. And that feels very exploration. It feels like, oh, I get to go have something new, and this is a novelty to me. And so you can almost tell when an ESFJ is in a really bad way because they get into compulsive shopping. That's like one of the biggest things or one of the biggest tip-offs. So if you're in a space where you find yourself driven to novelty in that way by shopping, or you find yourself doing a lot of speculating and assuming like people are up to no good and that's giving you kind of a bit of a thrill, that means you're going to your 10-year-old process too much and you want to really get back into that co-pilot of introverted sensing, or what we call memory. You really want to get to that space where you're not going to make any assumptions about anybody else. You're going to make sure that you only repeat verifiable information, that you're going to understand that other people are not necessarily up to no good just because they're offending your standards, your extroverted feeling or harmony standards, because maybe they have different standards, because they're a quirky individual and their life has been fashioned based on their own unique experiences. So this is really the sweet spot for doing the most growth and getting to the highest level of your personal happiness, and also being the most responsible with your relationships to make sure that you are doing conflict resolution, not conflict avoidance.
There's one more piece of your personality as an ESFJ that sits in your car, in the car model we use, and that has a development of about a 3-year-old child in your personality. It's a mental process that's technically called introverted thinking. We've nicknamed it accuracy. For people that lead with this process, that have it as a strength, they're asking the question, what makes sense to me personally? What makes logical, rational, consistent sense? And it really, when someone uses this as a strength, they don't bring the people element into it. They want to look at data and information separate from any emotion, separate from any social interaction, separate from people, because once people come into the mix, it clouds information. And so accuracy is very interested in information void of any kind of human manipulation to that information. Oftentimes, people that have this as a strength are attracted to formal logic or mathematics or computer programming, things of this nature. Not always, but these are some trends that people that have this as a strength bring to the table. But when this is at your 3-year-old position, it still has that desire for wanting the logical conclusion without social interaction. But remember, you're all about social interaction as an ESFJ. So what ends up happening is this ends up becoming your inner critic, that inner part of you that instead of looking at data for its pure sake, it takes data, bastardize it, and it turns it as a weapon against yourself. And so oftentimes when you're overtaxed in your social relationships and you feel like you've hit a wall, or you just feel overwhelmed, you'll go to this position. Because it has a development of a 3-year-old, it turns at you and starts wagging its tongue and saying, you're bad, and I've got a whole list of reasons why you're wrong or bad or you're a terrible person. And I'm going to list these down right now. And this inner critic comes up, and it's mean and it's nasty, and it just makes you feel like you are worthless and you don't have anything good going. And it has all these great, for its own logic, it's got all these great reasons and all this great logic of why you're a terrible person, or why this thing didn't work out, or why your relationship failed here, or why this person doesn't like you here, or why you can't get this thing done. And it feels so crippling, it feels overwhelming, and it feels like something's happening to you. This happens a few times a year, most likely, in a significant way. And when it does, you go, man, I did not feel myself there. I felt overwhelmed and just awful when I went to this position. So this is something that can trip you up in your personality that you need to be aware of in the midst of moving through life.
Our 3-year-old process often shows up in a good way too, though, in what we call an aspiration. And that basically means that in this blind spot of our 3-year-old process, and this is technically called your inferior process in the cognitive function stack. The inferior process is something that influences us in a way that we don't always understand why we're being influenced in that way. It's usually the source of challenges that are difficult for us to solve that other people seem to solve better than we do. And it's because they simply use this process to solve it, and we don't have as much access to this process. So we end up solving these challenges in unique ways. And so it becomes an influencer in us wanting to reach for something bigger. And we're not 100% sure why this is the thing we want to reach for, but it's almost like it's whispering in the back of our ear. And what I've noticed is that, you mentioned earlier, Joel, that ESFJs can be teachers. I've seen a lot of them in early education, in elementary schools, in jobs like management roles where they do a lot of teaching. I think being a teacher is one way that this process really shows up for ESFJs. And it's a desire to want to share information with other people. So if you find yourself in a space where you're using this in a self-critical way, and sort of like an inner mean person way, One of the best ways to get out of that space is to reevaluate how you're using it and focus more on concepts like, gathering more data and information, maybe teaching, maybe going to a place where you're sharing the information you have with other people and finding that very rewarding. But you can also use it in a very introverted way by doing something that has nothing to do with other human beings. If this part of you is getting really critical, it means that you need to go to the accuracy or introverted thinking process. And one of the best ways to do it is by just doing something completely antisocial for a while, like doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku puzzles or something that will just help you chill out. Now that we've gone through the whole CAR model, one of the things I want to mention is the image in my mind of an ESFJ has always been my sister. Now, my sister died in 2003, and that has always made me obviously that's made me sad because I lost my sister. We were never super close when I was younger, and I think it's because our personality types were so different, and she was also about 6 years older than me, so we also had a huge age span there. But it made me sad because I have a feeling that had she lived longer at this stage in our life, we would actually be very close. And I remember lessons that she taught me throughout my life that at the time I resisted them. But now that I look back, I realize that I became a better person because of some of the lessons she taught me. And one of the moments that really stands out for me is I was about 9 years old. And when I was young, my family had a bit of money. They didn't always have money. They didn't start out having money. And when my siblings were older, they were rather poor. But then my dad got this great marketing job, and he was making money hand over fist when I came along. And then when I turned about 11 or 12, they gave it all up to go be missionaries. And so we were poor again. So there was this window of when I was born up to about the age of 11 years old where my family had quite a bit of money. And so, as you can imagine, that was my whole experience, is having nice cars, nice clothes, nice house, on the golf course, etc. But that wasn't my sister's entire experience, right? When she was younger, we didn't have a lot of money. My parents didn't have a lot of money. So she had actually been raised in a more, in a lower socioeconomic class. And she was quite generous with people. When we ended up having more money when she was a teenager, I think she was very naturally generous to other people who didn't have money. And I remember she had a friend who had this old beater car, and her friend was giving my sister Tina and I a ride. And when I sat in the old beat up car, I think I was like 9 years old or 10 years old at the time, I was really embarrassed. I was really embarrassed that somebody was going to see me in this old beat up car. And I hid, I ducked my head down underneath the window so that nobody would see me in this car. And I looked over at my sister, and she had this confused look on her face, like she wasn't sure what I was doing. And then when she realized it was that I was embarrassed and I was hiding, that I was in this older car, she gave me this incredibly disappointed look. Like, how could you be like that? How could you be so shallow? And I was instantly shame washed over me. I immediately felt ashamed, and I popped my head back up, and then I just ate it for the rest of the ride. For the rest of the ride, I was like, something's going on inside of me, and first I felt ashamed that I was in an old car, and now I'm feeling ashamed that I felt ashamed. And it was a moment where I really reevaluated my relationship with material things. Now, I was just 9 or 10 years old. She was a teenager. She was 16. And she just found it to be so offensive that I would be embarrassed. And I think that was a moment where I went, I think I'm never going to do that again. I am never going to judge people by the quality of their things. And I'm never going to be the kind of person who's ashamed to have, whatever circumstances I'm in life, whatever socioeconomic circumstances I'm in, I'm just never going to see that as a cause for shame. And I became a lot more egalitarian at that moment. My ESFJ 16-year-old sister was the first person to really give me the lesson of egalitarianism. And when my parents gave up everything they had to go be missionaries, and we became quite poor, and we ended up living in a trailer park and, the whole thing, I was a lot better off as a person because my sister had taught me that lesson earlier when I was in a different situation. And I think these lessons, these styles of generosity of spirit, this kind of thinking is something that ESFJs can give to the world. Now, my sister was being very judgmental of me for being judgmental, and she should have been. That was a lesson I needed to learn. And if we can really appreciate these kinds of lessons that ESFJs will give to people and not take them personally or not be offended, like really understand that there's a lot for people of this type to offer if they're mature, if they're really developing that co-pilot process and really understanding people with a more generous spirit, which I think they naturally want to do. I think that this personality type, there's a reason there's so many. There's a reason that 13% of the female population is ESFJ. And there's a reason why 8% of the male population is ESFJ. We need a lot of them. They do good things for us. They're the people who take care of us. They're the people who teach us beautiful lessons. And I've always been really grateful to my sister for teaching me these kinds of lessons throughout our lives.
So what do you think? You've been listening to us. You can leave a comment or feedback or ask a question over at personalityhacker.com directly under this podcast. You can also join our growing community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
If you like what you hear, you can also subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're in a spirit of generosity, if you feel like you're in a giving mood, we would love for you to leave a rating and review on iTunes. Every rating and review on iTunes actually helps us out by getting more attention, our direction. iTunes plugs us a little bit more when they see a lot of ratings and reviews coming in. So if you're in a spirit of reciprocity and you want to leave a rating and review, that would be awesome.
And subscribe to this podcast so you can be a part of this conversation every week. We'd love to have you with us in these conversations. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk with you on the next episode of the Personality Hacker Podcast.